Snow White from 50 Famous Fairy Tales. One day in winter, a certain queen sat by a window sewing. As she looked out at the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon it. She gazed thoughtfully at the red drops and said, I wish my little daughter may be as white as the snow, as red as blood, and black as ebony window frame. Not long after this, a baby was born to the queen, and the child's skin was white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and black hair as ebony. The queen called her Snow White, but sad to say, the queen became ill and died. The next year, the king married another woman who was very beautiful, but so proud and selfish she could not bear to think that anybody in the world might be more beautiful than herself. Her greatest treasure was a magic mirror, which she used to look at and say, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? And the mirror would answer, The magic mirror tells you true, the fairest in the land is you. As the years passed, Snow White grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was fairer than the queen herself. Then one day, when the queen went to consult her mirror as usual, it said, The magic mirror tells you true, Snow White is lovelier than you. Excuse me. When the queen heard this, she turned pale with rage and envy. Calling a huntsman to her, she said, Take Snow White into the forest and kill her, and bring her heart back to me. The huntsman took Snow White into the forest, but when he lifted his sword to kill her, she begged him so sweetly to spare her life that he could not bear to touch her. I cannot hurt you, pretty child, but neither can I take you back, for the queen will kill us both. So he left her in the forest, and he killed a deer and took the deer's hearts to the cruel queen. Poor Snow White wandered on alone, not knowing where to seek shelter. Toward the evening, she spied a little cottage and went in to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small but very neat and clean. On the table was spread a white cloth with 7 little plates and 7 little forks, 7 little knives, 7 little spoons, 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds. As she was very hungry, Snow White ate and drank, taking a little from each plate, so as not to eat all the food from any one. After that, she thought she would lie down, so she tried each of the little beds. One was too long, another too short, another too hard, another too soft, but the last 7th one suited her, so she lay down and fell fast asleep. Presently, the masters of the cottage came home. They were 7 little dwarfs who worked in the mountains digging gold. They lighted their 7 lamps and saw immediately that all was not right. The first said, Who's been sitting in my stool? The second, Who's been eating from my plate? The third, Who's been nibbling my bread? The fourth, Who's been cutting with my knife? The fifth, Who's using my fork? The sixth, Who's been eating my porridge? The seventh, Who has been drinking my milk? And the first one looked around and said, Who's been lying in my bed? The rest came running to see, and each in turn cried out that somebody had laid in his bed. The 7th dwarf saw Snow White and called his brothers to come quickly. They held their lamps high so they could see better. When they saw the child, Snow White, they cried in one voice, What a lovely child! They were delighted with her beauty and took care not to waken her. The 7th dwarf slept with his brothers an hour with each so that Snow White might sleep on undisturbed. In the morning, Snow White awoke. At first, she was afraid of the little men, but they were very kind to her, and she soon overcame her fear and told them her story. Taking pity on her, the dwarfs said that if she would keep the house in order, cook and wash for them, she could stay on in the cottage, and they would take care of her. Snow White agreed. Every day the dwarfs went to work seeking gold and silver in the mountains, and Snow White remained at home, and every day the dwarfs warned her, The queen will soon find out who you are, so take care and let no one in. The queen, now that she thought Snow White was dead, believed that was certainly she was the loveliest lady in the land. Going to her glass, she said, Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? The glance answered, The magic mirror tells you true, Snow White is lovelier than you. She's living still in a forest glen and dwells with 7 little men. Then the queen was mad with rage, for she knew the mirror always spoke the truth. She knew the huntsman had betrayed her. She could not bear to think anyone who lived was more beautiful than she was, and so she disguised herself as an old woman peddler and went out over the hills to the place where the dwarfs lived. She knocked on the door and cried, Fine wares to sell. Snow White looked out at the window and said, Good morning, good woman. What have you to sell? Good wares, fine wares, the old woman answers, laces, ribbons of all color. I'll let the old lady in, thought Snow White. She seems an honest soul, so she unbolted the door. Bless me, said the old woman, how loosely your bodice fits. Let me lace it with one of my new laces. Snow White did not dream of any harm coming to her, and she let the old woman do as she wished. She pulled the laces so tight that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if she were dead. "That will put an end to your beauty," said the spiteful queen, and hurried away. When the dwarfs returned home that evening, they were grieved to find Snow White stretched out on the floor motionless. They lifted her up, and when they found the trouble, they cut the lacing. In a short while she began to breathe, and soon her life came back again. Then the dwarf said, "The old woman was the queen herself. You must be more careful next time and not let anyone in while we're away." When the queen got home, she went straight to her mirror and spoke as usual. To her great surprise, it said, "The magic mirror tells you true. Snow White is lovelier than you. She's living in a forest glen and dwells there with 7 little men." The queen was furious when she heard this, and dressing herself in a different disguise, she poisoned a comb and started off again toward the dwarf's cottage. When she reached there, she knocked on the door, cried, "Fine wares to sell." Snow White called out, "I dare not let anyone in." Then the queen said, "As you like, but just look at my beautiful combs." And when she took the poisoned comb and gave it to Snow White, it looked so pretty that she took it and put it in her hair just to try it, but the minute it touched her head, she fell down senseless. By good luck, the dwarfs returned early in that evening, and when they saw Snow White lying on the floor, they could guess who had been there. They found the poisoned comb, and when they took it away, she recovered. They warned her once again not to open the door to anyone. In the meantime, the queen went home to her mirror, trembling with rage when it still told her where that Snow White lived. Then she said, "Snow White will die if it costs me my life." She secretly prepared an apple, one side which was poisonous. Whoever tasted it was sure to die. The other side, the apple, was harmless. Then the queen dressed herself as a peasant's wife and traveled over the hills to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. Snow White put her head out the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in, for I promised the dwarfs. Do as you please, but at any rate take this pretty apple. I shall give it to you as a present." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take it." "You silly girl," answered the woman. "What are you afraid of? Do you think it's poisoned? Come, eat one half, and I'll eat the other." Snow White was tempted to taste it, for the apple looked ripe and juicy. And when she saw the woman bite into it, she took a bite. She had scarcely put the piece into her mouth when she fell upon the floor. "This time nothing will save you," muttered the queen. And she went home to her mirror and asked the usual question. The mirror answered, "Magic mirror tells you true, the fairest in the land is you." Then her envious heart was glad, for she feared Snow White no more. When the dwarfs returned, they found Snow White lying on the floor. No breath passed her lips, and they were afraid she was dead. They lifted her up, combed her hair, washed her face with wine and water, but all was in vain. Snow White did not move. They laid her on her bed, and all 7 men watched over her for 3 days. She looked so lifeless that they put her in a glass coffin so that they might still look at her. They wrote her name in gold and placed it on a hill, and one of the dwarfs always sat by it and watched. Thus Snow White lay for a long, long time, still looking as though she were asleep. At last a prince came through the woods and saw Snow White. He fell in love with her at sight and begged the dwarfs to give her to him. Then he offered the dwarfs money and earnestly prayed them to let her take her with him. But they said, "We shall not part with her for all the gold in the world." At last, however, they took pity on him and consented. He called his servants to lift the coffin, and in doing so one stumbled and fell. This jolt knocked a piece of the apple from Snow White's mouth, and she awakened, crying out, "Where am I?" The prince answered, "You are safe with me." Then telling her what had happened, he said, "I love you better than all the world, Snow White. Please come to my father's palace with me and be my bride." Snow White consented and went home with the prince. His parents loved her at once, and everything was prepared for the wedding with great pomp and splendor. Among the rest, Snow White's old enemy, the wicked queen, was invited to the feast. As she was dressing herself in fine rich clothes, she looked in the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And the glass answered, "The magic mirror tells you true, the bride is lovelier than you." When she heard this, the queen turned red with rage, but her envy and curiosity were so great she could not resist going to see the bride. When she saw it was no other than Snow White, who she thought she had been dead for a long time, she choked with passion and fell in a fit and died. But Snow White and the prince lived on and reigned happily over the land for many, many years.